What are the psychological processes of abusers? Why do abusers abuse? What are the subtler forms of abuse? What are the phases of the cycle of abuse? What are the psychological consequences to the victims? How common is domestic violence, both in the UK and also separately in the USA? And what are the warning signs of domestic abuse? Hello, cruel world. My name is Dr. Sohom Das. I'm a consultant forensic psychiatrist. I assess mentally disordered offenders for a living so that you don't have to. Domestic violence it's an uncomfortable topic, but it's something people just don't want to talk about. A bit like your racist Uncle Jack. All those questions that I said before, I'm going to answer them all. So sit back, relax, and welcome to a Psych for Sore Minds. I educate while you estimate. I educate while you vegetate. As always, let's start this episode off with a real case. I'm going to turn down my joke meter and I'm going to put on my serious face. So there's a woman called Valérie Bacot, a French woman in her 40s who suffered from a lifetime of abuse at the hands of a husband who she eventually killed in March 2016 in France. Although Bacot was technically found guilty of his murder, she was still able to walk free. And this all happened a few months ago in June 2021. Her husband was a man called Daniel Paulet, not to be mistaken for the word poulet, although they're both French chickens. Valérie suffered rape from the age of 12. First, because Paulet was her stepfather and he was 25 years older than her, and then later he forced her to marry him and fathered 4 children with her. He spent about 2.5 years in prison for assaulting her in the 1990s, but then he returned to the family home and he got her pregnant when she was about 17. Paulet would slap Valérie, he would kick her, he would punch her, he would choke her. She basically described her life as extreme hell. So this is already a pretty shocking story, and I'm afraid to say it actually gets worse because Paulet then forced her to work as a prostitute for truck drivers at the back of their family's minivan. He would give her instructions through an earpiece that he forced her to wear, and he would make money. They were charged between 20 and 50 euros per time. So in formal psychiatric jargon, Paulet really is a pile of excrement. He threatened to kill her if she refused, and he pointed a gun at her many times. Ironically, the very same gun that she would eventually use to kill him. She snapped and shot him when they were in this minivan. Now, I've actually done a much more detailed video on Valérie Bacot on this channel, which really hammers home the impact of domestic violence, and also I kind of dissect battered woman syndrome as a psychiatric defense. So go check out that video if you want to know more about this case. I suppose the cynics amongst you might think that I'm just recycling material here, to which I would say, firstly, recycling is good for the environment, and secondly, I've been really busy rescuing old people from trees and helping cats cross the road. You're Bombay. So let's move on. What are the psychological processes of abusers? Usually they share particular character traits. They're usually controlling, they're manipulative, and those two things, controlling and manipulative, are similar, but they're not identical. So controlling means making direct orders, like you cannot leave the house. And manipulative is sort of subtly, indirectly forcing the victim by limiting their choices, such as, if you leave this house, I'll kill myself. Abusers usually feel entitled, specifically in terms of the ruling of the dynamics of the relationships. So they believe that they're in charge and they deserve to be in charge. And they even often see themselves as victims. Why do abusers abuse? What are the goals from the perpetrator's perspective? Well, in psychological terminology, we would call this mate retention behaviour. So the offender uses violence as a tool to prevent their intimate partner from leaving them. So both physical and psychological restraint. It makes the abusers feel powerful, and it's usually due to some sort of psychological impotence or massive inferiority complex. Often, the perpetrators are actually victims of abuse themselves, or at least have witnessed domestic violence between their parents, and they see this as an appropriate way to manage conflict. So they kind of model the power dynamic. They believe that somebody always has to be in charge in a relationship. Somebody always has to dominate. Next question, what are the subtler forms of abuse? Well, there's obvious types of abuse like sexual, physical, and even emotional, but there are also more discreet, clandestine forms of abuse that relate to control, such as isolation, preventing the victims from seeing friends or family or socializing, and also economic control. So that is sort of taking away the financial independence from the victim, and sometimes the perpetrator might even spend the victim's money unnecessarily, which makes it harder for their partner to leave. So in my opinion, this form of abuse is very important to recognize because the victims often don't have the confidence to report it to the police or to their friends. And I've personally assessed numerous victims, most of them women, who've been victim of this type of control, and they were actually unsure if it was even a crime. And even if they did have a crime, they often had a lack of evidence. So just to be crystal clear, if you're watching this and you're in a relationship with this kind of behavior, it is completely unacceptable. And I would say to you that there's a risk of this behavior escalating and the situation getting worse. So what I'm saying is you need to leave. So dear viewers, I know this is all a very painful topic, but if you have any experiences that you want to share, please put them in the comment section. I'm all about generating healthy discussion. Okay, let's move on. What are the phases of the cycle of abuse? Generally, there's a kind of pattern. It starts with this build-up phase, and that's where there's tension and general disharmony within the relationship. And the next is the standover phase, which is like an increase in threats and verbal hostility. And then there's an explosion phase, which is the violent outburst. Next is the remorse phase, where the abuser kind of excuses their behavior, and they often try to suggest that it was the victim's fault. You know, like, you're always pushing my buttons. Only you can make me feel like this. I'm so passionate about you. And much of this is related to gaslighting. So if you want to know what gaslighting is, please see my separate video on this channel. Chickadee, check it out. Then there's the pursuit phase, where promises are made, like, it will never happen again, or I'll try and keep my temper under check. And that is all followed by the honeymoon phase, which is a brief respite in the relationship before the cycle starts again. Next question, what is the psychological impact on the victims? Well, there are extensive mental health consequences from post-traumatic stress disorder. I mean, that's identified in anywhere between 30 to 80% of victims, depending on which study you read. And then there's depression, anxiety, suicidality, substance misuse, sleep disorders, basically a lot of different types of impacts. Very briefly, post-traumatic stress disorder is when somebody's gone through a massive trauma and they relive that trauma in terms of flashbacks or nightmares, plus they have this background anxiety called hypervigilance, which is where you're constantly on edge. So for example, loud noises might startle you. On top of all of that, there's an emotional numbness, and there's also avoidance behavior. So you avoid situations or triggers of the original trauma. Those are the core features of PTSD. I've done a video explaining the difference between PTSD and complex PTSD. If you're interested, check that out. Depression, you understand what that is: low mood, lack of energy, lack of enjoyment, lack of motivation. Anxiety, you know what that is. It's feeling constantly sort of nervous, either about something specific, which is kind of a phobia, or something else. Whew, you Bombay. Next question, how common is domestic abuse in the UK? Well, it's quite hard to judge definitively, as so many of these offences are underreported. But according to the Crime Survey in England and Wales in 2018, only 20% of women who experienced partner abuse in the last 12 months actually reported it to the police. Why? Well, I think the biggest hurdle is fear, that the perpetrator won't be arrested, and therefore the victim might suffer even more retribution, even more violence, and they might have to suffer a higher level of control and scrutiny. On top of all of that, often the victim feels psychologically or financially kind of tied into the relationship, even obligated due to children. So as a psychiatrist, I can't really tell people what to do. As a YouTuber, I definitely cannot. But as a human being and the owner of two little humans, I would say do not bring kids into the world in an abusive relationship, or in fact, any unstable relationships. To me, it's a bit like recruiting fire to sort out your mounting paperwork. It ain't gonna end well. Also, often the victim's self-esteem is absolutely crushed due to this repetitive psychological abuse, making them feel that they can't even move on. For example, finding another partner. Another issue, in my opinion, is that it kind of happens very gradually and subtly, and it's barely even noticeable. Also, I think it's fair to say that sometimes there might be good times in the relationship, which makes the victim kind of justify at times in their own mind for wanting to stay in the relationship. So, how common is domestic violence in the UK? I'm about to answer that, but first I would like to introduce you to this channel, A Psych for Sore Minds. My name is Dr. Sohom Das. I'm a consultant forensic psychiatrist. I assess mentally disordered offenders in prisons and in courts and in psychiatric units. I'm also your favourite Asian British forensic psychiatrist YouTuber from London, or at least I'm in your top 5. This channel addresses a whole range of issues related to mental illness and offending and the crossover between the two, from high-profile cases and my own psychoanalysis, individual diagnoses, to talking about my own patients at times, although I keep that anonymised. Subscribe, you have to subscribe. Not only does it help me out immeasurably, but it stops your urge from snacking at crisps at 11 p.m. You've been getting a bit big around the midriff. I've noticed it, you've noticed it, your mum's noticed it. Back to the question, how common is domestic violence in the UK? Well, between March 2019 and 2020, an estimated 1.6 million women experienced domestic violence in the UK. And I was shocked to learn, on average, how many calls related to domestic abuse the police in England and in Wales receive every hour. Viewers, would you like to take a guess at what that number is? It is very sobering. Answers in a few moments. Next question, how common is domestic violence in the USA? More than 10 million adults in the United States experience abuse by their romantic or intimate partners every year. Next question, what are the warning signs of domestic abuse? So the reason I'm telling you this is it might be helpful if you're worried about a loved one. Physical signs are pretty obvious, aren't they? Black eyes, bruises, busted lips, sprains, etc. The emotional signs might be a bit more kind of hidden. This can be anything from agitation to anxiety to changes in sleep patterns, maybe developing a drug and alcohol habit, or a change in personalities, such as the victim appearing, weak or apologetic, and generally having lower self-esteem, feeling fearful, signs of depression, all of those things. And in terms of actual behavioural changes, the victim can become quite reserved and distant. You might see them isolating themselves. They might cancel appointments or meetings, and they might do this with you at the last minute. And it might not just be because of your terrible chat. Also, the victims tend to be overly secretive about the person they're in a relationship with, usually due to fear. And the other signs might be that they might hint at their partner's behaviour, such as describing him as moody or being bad-tempered when he's drinking, just for examples. Also, the victim might seem to need permission from the perpetrator, permission to go out and socialise. They might have constant calls or texts from their partner. They might have very little money available to them. They might not have access to a credit card, for example. These are all the things that you need to be looking out for in your friends. So, the eagle-eyed cherries amongst you would have noticed that I've been referring to the perpetrators as he and the victims as she. Obviously, abuse can occur the other way around, and it can also occur in same-sex couples. But as a generalisation, I think it's fair to say that men commit far more crimes. There are approximately 75,000 men and 3.5 thousand women in prison in the United Kingdom in 2020. Men are generally far more violent, we're generally more controlling. I'm allowed to make those generalizations because I have a penis. However, the Office for National Statistics figures show that every year, about 1 in 3 victims of domestic violence are men, yet only about 5% are formally offered support by services. So I think that really helps highlight the disparity of what is seen as acceptable in society. Okay, dear viewers, I asked you on average how many calls related to domestic abuse do the police in England and Wales receive every hour? The answer is 100 calls. I mean, that is mind-blowing to me. I know I sometimes make jokes, but there's nothing funny about that. That's a very somber, terrifying statistics. If there are any victims of domestic violence watching this, I urge you to call the National Domestic Violence Hotline. The numbers should be in the link below. Okay, let's wrap things up. To conclude, what did we learn today, kids? We learned about the horrific case of Valerie Bacot. See my other vid for more details. We learned about the psychological processes of abusers. We learned about the psychological consequences to the victims. We talked about the subtler forms of abuse and the subtle kinds of warning signs. We learned about the cycle of abuse, and we learned how common domestic abuse is, both in the UK and in the USA. We also learned that your Uncle Jack is a racist. Your Bombay. Was there anything else to talk about, or is that... Oh, sorry. Ah, yeah, of course, my book. So I have a book, dear viewers, coming out. It's going to be called In Two Minds. It will be released in March 2022. It's a bit like these videos, but more of a deep dive, a lot more personal, more autobiographical, talk about my own cases much, much more, and my life in training and becoming a forensic psychiatrist. It's going to be dope. You got to go check it out. All that's left for me to say is stay euthymic, and please, whatever happens, do not forget, I love you.